Okay.
Put the audio.
The audio is on my computer. It's a little, oh, let me,
We just sent a reminder out to everybody who's been registered, so if he shows up, that'd be good. If you want to text him.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you want it to be the meeting. Yeah.
there we go. Okay. So welcome everyone to our ABC session for March. Tonight we have Dr. Charlie Domahidi, who will be speaking to us about LGBTQ plus prison populations and the issues that are affecting them, and maybe a few other things, but that's the gist. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Charlie, and let me just pull up the PowerPoint presentation here.
Okay, perfect.
Hold on. I'll share the screen so that it's recorded.
Go to the bottom. Oh, you got it. Okay, hello, everyone. Thank
having me. It's like a small group and it's all people I know. So I feel like weird to be so formal. So I just want to give like the content warning. We're gonna be talking about some sensitive topics, specifically like assault and rape and crime and things like that. So just be aware. And then also I know the subject of incarcerated people can be a bit of a controversial subject. So we will try and engage with the subject in a sensitive and open-hearted manner. One other brief disclaimer, none of the information that is contained in this presentation is going to address youth. So the LGBT youth population is also engaged or interacts with the criminal justice system at really high rates. But we could have like an entire separate presentation just about like juveniles. And so this would have been too long if we talked about both populations. So I just decided to stick with adults. But that is not to say that the like circumstances that LGBT youth are experiencing isn't an important issue itself. Okay. So yeah, you can go to the next one. Just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about what the LGBTQI plus incarcerated population looks like, some of the needs and challenges that they face, different existing protections that already exist, and then different actions and advocacy or things that are more timely or relevant, things in the news very recently that affect this population. So if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, before I get into some of this information, I would just like to ask, does everyone have a fairly good understanding of how the incarcerated system works, both nationally and at the state level? Or would you like me to just give a very, very superficial overview?
A superficial overview would be helpful.
Okay, so in the United States, we have the federal prison system, which operates nationally and is completely independent and separate from the systems of the state. So in New York, we have the New York Department of Corrections and I think community supervision or something like that. And they're in charge of all of the state prisons in New York State. We also have local facilities, which are typically called jails, which operate at the county level and are under the purview of the county. All of these separate institutions are funded differently. And so when we talk about some of the issues and the lawsuits that happened in New York State, those happened at jails, both in Steuben County and the other is Boone County, I believe. And though, because they are local jails, that we'll discuss some of the context as to like why things are how they are in jails versus state facilities. And then also again, at the federal level, the federal prisons are completely separate from what's happening at the state level.
Mhm.
Does that give a? Okay. So, it is really, really unfortunate and sad to say that our LGBTQ siblings experience high rates of homelessness, poverty, unemployment, discrimination, and violence, which drives their overrepresentation in our criminal justice system. The LGBT population is overrepresented in all areas of the criminal justice system: arrests, incarceration, sentencing lengths, unjust probation and parole decisions. So it's kind of a system-wide problem. LGBTQ adults are incarcerated at 3 times the rate of the total adult population, and then the youth representation is double their share in the general population. So again, overrepresented, yes.
Maybe later you could share a little bit about what it is about this population that puts them at risk. for being-
Yes, so in the conclusion-ish
Okay.
thing, we'll talk a little bit about the risk factors and maybe also more relevant, how certain the tone of the administration and some of these executive orders are exacerbating some of those risk factors in the
thanks.
population, yeah.
Mhm.
So according to a survey in 2022, 31% of LGBTQ people reported some form of incarceration at some point in the last 5 years. So
Jeez.
that is, so like 1 out of 3
Yeah.
LGBT people has had some contact with incarceration in the last 5 years.
How does that compare to the general population?
I think it's much less.
It
So
almost has to be.
in the general population, the incarceration rates vary based on like your age, your race, and your sex.
Mhm.
For black men, I think it's also like 30%. They're a very like high risk population, but for like white men, I think it's like 1 in 6. So lower.
Yeah.
Recent executive orders have significantly impacted the experience of transgender inmates, especially in federal facilities. So that's why we're talking about this, and that's why it's particularly relevant to talk about right now. The executive order, I'll talk about it in a little bit, but the one on January 20th that dictated that the federal government only recognizes 2 sexes.
Mhm.
That is what's now impacting how the Federal Bureau of Prisons is responding to transgender inmates. Okay, oh, and also one other note I have here, social circumstances which contribute to criminalization of the LGBT population are also being exacerbated by a lot of these executive orders and policies. Okay. And please, yeah, jump in with questions, discussion at any point. So, one thing to keep in mind, when I was going in and starting to prepare for this presentation, I was very naively thinking I would have access to the data that I had like a year ago at this time, and that was not the case. So some of the stuff was a bit more difficult to kind of get to than I would have liked. So I will just say that. This is an overview of some of the information and estimates that we have. So we about, oh, someone has rung a doorbell.
A customer.
I will pause while Peter, you have to,
They're.
Oh, they're in?
So that's
You don't-
Nathan.
okay, perfect.
Hi. If you could just let us know if you could hear us and if you can see my screen. Which maybe you aren't gonna look at since it looks like you're in the car.
I'm good. I can see and hear.
Welcome.
I do have the PowerPoint as a PDF. Peter has it, so I would be happy to share it with everyone. The references and stuff, a lot of the reports are linked in the reference slide, so you'll be able to just click right on it if you want to learn more. So first, we're gonna talk a little bit about lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals, and then we're gonna talk about transgender inmates in the next slide. I just kind of kept it a little bit separate, but again, rough estimates, about 90,000 people identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual in prisons, both state and federal, and then 34,000 in jails in the United States. So in prisons, about 33% of women identify as lesbian or bisexual. So that is compared to 5.5% in the general population. So we're looking at a significant overrepresentation of lesbian and bisexual women in the incarcerated population. And then for men, again, for gay or bisexual men, it's 7.6 in the prison population versus 6.8. Is that? Yeah, no, 5.5% of gay and bisexual men in prisons, and then in the general population, it's 6.8. So actually less gay and bisexual men are incarcerated in prisons than in the general population. With jails, 26.4% of women and or lesbian and bisexual women. Again, that's comparing to the 7.6 in the general population. And then for gay and bisexual men, it's 3.3, which is half of how that percentage in the general population. So not as many gay or bisexual men, significantly more lesbian and bisexual women.
Interesting.
Yes, and we can perhaps, if you wanna explore, we can say that for the end, but yes.
Absolutely.
So that is an interesting development. One thing as well, another research survey found that lesbian and bisexual women in prisons and jails were sentenced to longer periods of incarceration than straight women. So now you're looking at the length of the sentence, it's longer. Gay and bisexual men were more likely than straight men to have sentences longer than 10 years. So also now we're looking at disparity in the length of the sentence with respect to our LGBT population. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so with transgender inmates, again, these are rough estimates. One thing to note, there is no data on transgender inmates in jails because that data is not collected. So if there's articles that such and such transgender person, is suing the jail, we know that is a single transgender person, but the institutions don't collect that data, so we don't know. We have no idea how many there are. So we have approximately 6,000 transgender inmates in federal and state prisons, and of that, we know about 4,000 of them are in state facilities, which means about 2,000 are in federal prisons. So as of February 20th, this is really recent data, we had 2,198 transgender inmates. This was reported by the Bureau of Prisons in a legal document. Generally, there's about 150,000 federal inmates, so 1.5% of the total federal population is transgender inmates. Of that amount, about 700 are trans men and about 1,600 are transgender women. And now this is the really interesting thing. Of the 1,600 transgender women, only 22 are currently in female facilities. The rest are in male facilities. And only one trans man is currently housed in a male facility. The rest are in women facilities. So, some speculation there as to why that would be. When we talk in the next couple of slides about the lawsuits at the federal level, it's this population of women that are being threatened to be removed from the female facilities. They're the ones that are bringing the lawsuits for, because the rest of them, all like 90% of them, are already in male facilities anyway. But I'll explain, because they wanna do other stuff. In addition to, keeping them in facilities that match their birth sex, they wanna like do other things as well. But yeah, but for the most part, most trans women are in male facilities, most, trans men are in women facilities. 16% of trans people have experienced incarceration at one point during their lives. 1 in 5 trans women have experienced incarceration at some point in their lives. And nearly half of all Black trans people have experienced incarceration in their lives. So again, like with the general population, we are seeing significant overrepresentation of people of color in the in criminal justice system. What else do I want to say about that? Okay, I think that's it. Any questions about, oh, and then this is just a chart to visually, with your eyes, see how many more lesbian and bisexual women exist in our prisons and jails compared to the general population. And then less men, which is, again, interesting. Okay, so the next couple of slides, we're gonna talk about some of the needs and challenges. And do any of you know about the strike with the prison guards in New York
A
State?
bit.
Okay, apparently one of the reasons was related to solitary confinement, so just bookmark that in your mind, because we are talking about solitary confinement now. So research demonstrates the clinical impacts of isolation can be similar to those of physical torture. Responses to solitary confinement can include perceptual distortions, hallucinations, increased anxiety, rage, fear, lack of impulse control, depression, sleep problems, self-mutilation, and lower levels of brain function. So prison officials disproportionately place LGBTQ people in solitary confinement because of their gender identity or sexuality. The main reason is because it's for their safety. So, it's like protective isolation because they are afraid that they'll be, like harmed if they're with the general population.
And I will say you, just for the recording, you were doing air quotes there, I think, right?
Yes, yes, thank you, thank you. So, in a survey of 1,100 LGBTQ and incarcerated people, 85% of them reported that they had been held in solitary confinement at one point during their sentence. That compares to 20% of the general prison population. So significantly more in isolation. And then Black, Indigenous, and people of color inmates, LGBTQ inmates, were twice as likely to be put in solitary confinement compared to white LGBTQ inmates. So there's a really it's beyond the scope of this talk, but within the literature, there is a lot about the harms of solitary confinement. It's significantly overused in the United States, much more than other industrialized countries. And the LGBTQ population is subjected to solitary confinement at significantly higher rates. So again, they're at those risks of depression, other cognitive and mental health decline. Craig, you're a psychiatrist, you know all about what that could be. And unfortunately, sometimes people are put in solitary confinement for really lengthy durations. I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the United States, there's someone who was in solitary confinement for like 43 years.
Oh, my God.
So that's not the norm. These are like people who are in there for decades. That's like not like usual, but I think technically more than 15 days is considered torture under the Geneva Convention. And so people in the United States are in solitary confinement for longer than 15 days. It's like a year or two, that's more normal. 10 years, 15, 20, that's unusual, but like a year or two, you hear about that a lot.
The one about the contrast with the total population, that is more than 3 times.
mhm,
You're more like, if you're LGBTQ, you're 3 times likely to be in solitary confinement, over 3.
yeah,
And it's striking how every time you add a new layer of like marginalized identity, the
increases.
rates of everything go up.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. That's like intersectionality,
Mhm.
depending on like the amount of marginalized identities you hold, you're adding very, very increased risk of, all of these negative outcomes.
But we better not talk about DEI in this
Yeah.
country, because that's the real problem.
Yeah,
Air quotes.
next slide, please. Okay, so some of the safety issues and victimization. So, this relates to the risk that inmates face. Within American culture, I think unfortunately, the prison rape is still like a trope that like it's coming out of fashion. I don't see it as much, but I feel like it's still kind of a thing that people joke about.
Yeah.
Sexual assault in prisons remains a significant issue, especially for LGBTQ population. So one thing that we'll talk about in a later slide is the Prison Rape Elimination Act. This was a piece of federal legislation that was brought about in 2003 to address the issue of sexual victimization in federal prisons. So that was adopted, and it requires state and federal institutions to do really extensive reporting. I will talk in a future slide about all of that, but as a result of that legislation, we do have access to this data about sexual assault and sexual abuse. It isn't disaggregated by like LGBTQ identity, so we don't know necessarily in PREA, depending on how the state wants to report. We don't necessarily know, but we are able to know like how many assaults generally happen in each state, in each facility. You have a, okay,
And it applies to both federal and state,
yes, and some local
because that
facilities.
doesn't always happen.
So PREA, it has to apply to, so whether or not they comply, it is against the law for them not to comply. Like, they could choose not to, but technically they're legally obligated to submit PREA if they are a federal or state institution. Local, no, some local institutions choose to submit PREA, but, they don't have to. But all state and all federal, in the country and District of Columbia or whatever, all of them have to. But again, whether or not they comply, if they don't, it's more of them violating the law.
I can mention it later, but there was a NPR segment the other day that talked about a law that applies to federal but not to state. And so federal facilities are trying to make an effort in one regard, but the state people don't have to.
So the PREA mostly deals with reporting,
Oh, okay,
so it's not necessarily,
a demand they do something.
yeah, it's about how they have to take the report, standardized definitions of how they're defining sexual assault,
Gotcha,
sexual
okay.
harassment.
Yeah,
Just so we have solid data collected.
yeah, and that would make more sense to
Yeah.
have it apply to both, so.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why it doesn't apply. I do understand why it doesn't apply to local. They have no money, but, that's probably why.
Yeah.
Where was I? LGBTQ adults and youth in the criminal justice system are at an increased risk of sexual assault and harassment from other incarcerated people in the facility, but also staff when compared to cisgender and straight inmates. So, LGBT, like lesbian, gay, bisexual men and women, as well as men who have sex with men and women who have sex with women, because for the category purposes, some people in prison have sex with members of the same, like, gender or sex, but they don't consider themselves to be gay. So they have to have like a separate category, that's why it's written out like that, but the LGBT population is 10 times more likely to be sexually victimized, and, than, than another incarcerated person, and 2.6 times more likely to be victimized by staff. So, yeah. And then in 2012, we have the National Inmate Study. 12% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in prison and 9% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in jail reported experiencing sexual victimization from another incarcerated person, and that is compared to 1% of straight people in prison and jails. So, again, a quite significant difference. And then of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in prison and jails, 5% and 4% respectively reported sexual victimization from staff compared to 2% of incarcerated straight people. So, unfortunately, they are at increased risk, both from other inmates, but also from staff. Not ideal. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. This is, specific to our transgender inmates. So once behind bars, trans people face extremely high rates of harassment, physical and sexual assault, frequently denied routine health care, and are at a high risk of being sent to solitary confinement. Again, as we talked about in the previous slide. Many imprisoned trans people are placed in indefinite prolonged solitary confinement, again, for their safety. So we said over 90% of trans women are in all male facilities. Obviously, they have to keep them separate. Sometimes they have begun transition already. And so in order to avoid them coming to harm, they put them in isolation, which again is is a problematic response to having them in that facility.
Trying to decide better of two evils.
Yeah. So in 2012, when we had this data, 40% of trans people in state and federal prisons reported sexual victimization. Federal data shows that transgender prisoners are 10 times more likely than other inmates to report being sexually abused. And then, hold on. I lost my. Okay. Most prisons in the US currently house transgender people by their sex assigned at birth or according to their genital characteristics, not their gender identity, which only increases their risk of harassment and assault. So again, generally the policy in a lot of federally and in a lot of states is to house them by their birth sex. But prior to the January 20th executive order, some facilities interpreted PREA to allow them to do a case-by-case determination, which is why 22 female inmates are in all women facilities. Those 22 were determined to be safer in female facilities. And so that mechanism did exist while it was widely underused. It did exist. But again, the fact that they aren't, more of them aren't, it does open them up to harassment. Questions?
Thinking about, so what,
Oh,
oh, sorry, I know.
no, go ahead. I can't
Um,
see you on the screen, so I don't know. Yes.
Is that better? I don't know. But so thinking of the 22 cases, where So those women were allowed to be in the same facility. Did was it for the trans man that was there's one that was housed federally? Was that a similar case? Same mechanisms and everything?
Yeah, so I would venture to say, I don't know this for sure, but I would venture to say that that trans man that's in a male facility has undergone like gender reassignment surgery and therefore has like
Yeah.
male anatomy. And so
Okay.
they deem it's appropriate for that trans man to be in a male facility. It's similar with the trans women. They're like really far along in at least what the federal government identifies as being really far along in the transition process.
Mhm.
So it's justified, that's what they use to justify putting them in the women facilities.
So aside from that
Thank you very much.
being fucked up in so
Yeah.
many ways, in any way, like. I assume that the reason they make those determinations is because of like, oh, this person identifies as a woman, but who has like male genitalia is someone who, oh, we're afraid they're gonna go around raping people if we put them in a women's prison. So like they're concerned about that, but there's clearly very, very lackluster concern about like rape in a general sense and like sexual assault, particularly of LGBTQ people,
Yeah.
particularly. So like they're like using as an excuse to harm people, a thing that they like don't even worry about otherwise, which I
Yeah,
don't have a question. It just is the hypocrisy is driving me mad.
yeah. And then you're actually gonna love the hypocrisy, because this next slide talks about
Oh, no.
healthcare and access to gender affirming treatment.
Excellent.
So, hormone therapy and gender affirming surgery are medical necessities that are exceptionally difficult for trans and gender non-conforming people to access in the prison environment. So in this particular survey by Black and Pink, 44% of transgender, non-binary, and two-spirit respondents were denied access to hormones that they requested. Incarcerated people and advocates note that it can take months to years for people in prison to obtain gender dysphoria diagnoses, which are required for treatment. So, of the people in the survey, again, going back to the Black and Pink survey, of the survey, all of them were transgender, non-binary, and two-spirit. Only 43% of them received a gender dysphoria diagnosis. So 100% of them were self-identified as trans, non-binary, or two-spirit. Only 43% received an official diagnosis. 31% were denied diagnoses, often due to delays in care, administrative barriers, and sometimes inadequately equipped staff. Like the medical infrastructure in the facility was not available for someone to be qualified to make that diagnosis. Similarly, only 23% of these respondents reported taking hormones, and 44% were denied access to hormones. In a different 2009 study of trans women, 21% were denied hormones while incarcerated, and 15% of them were denied any medical care while they were incarcerated. So again, very problematic. The issue of healthcare is interesting because we kind of touched on this in our private side discussion. The idea that inmates should get healthcare is controversial in the United States. People feel like they broke the law. Why do they deserve healthcare? I don't have healthcare. So it's a bit like of a spicy issue, but I wanted to put this information in 2022 fiscal year. 0.1% of the total healthcare expenditures of the Bureau of Prisons went to the treatment of transgender inmates. So it is really a teeny tiny fraction.
That issue of gender dysphoria, one of the criteria I think has to do with having difficult emotions about it.
Mhm.
So if somebody's transgender and they're fine with it themselves, they wouldn't get a diagnosis of
Yeah.
dysphoria, so.
I think, so outside of talking about inmates per se, I think a lot of people in the healthcare profession are discussing the issues with the medicalization of
Mhm.
gender dysphoria, some of the issues with how it's like cataloged or whatever, and how healthcare is denied based on like a certain standard of, presentation of gender dysphoria,
Mhm.
for like insurance purposes and stuff, and that
Right, I
sucks.
mean, the diagnoses get manipulated all the time.
Yeah.
But in terms of actually trying to take care of somebody,
Mhm.
if somebody's not having a problem with something, you don't do anything about it.
Yeah.
So,
But yeah, so this particular issue is a little bit spicier. The idea that they should have access to this medical care. I'm not sure what to say about it. Some of the issues that occur is when people who are doing hormone replacement therapy are incarcerated and then suddenly they don't have access to hormone replacement therapy. That's not good for them to just be like cut off.
mhm.
Um, that brings about its own problems.
I had two questions,
Go ahead, yeah.
but where are they? Oh, if they are denied medical, whatever they need, so even, you said all medical health care, so even if they got raped, they would be denied healthcare for whatever would be damaged.
So in the one survey, 15% were denied care. Any medical care, that's just a fraction of people. Typically, in at least federal and state prisons, you do have access to some level of medical care. Again, outside the scope of this discussion, but in the way that the systems work in the United States, because each state is responsible for its own state prison, it's very impacted by like funding. And so states that have more funding can have more and better access to healthcare. States that don't have funding, the care is gonna be a lot poorer.
Well, it might also depend on whether that care is seen as optional or mandatory.
Yeah,
Having a wart removed is probably
Mhm.
optional.
right.
Having a cancer attended to is
Mhm.
not, so.
And depending on the overall perspective of the state as well, if they're like a more rehabilitative perspective state, they tend to have better, more comprehensive care. And then if it's a more like a punitive state, they'll try and get away with bare minimum because they don't want people to have access, because they don't think they should. And
It's
again,
part of the punishment.
yeah, exactly. And some people believe that.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question? That's not to say, that's not to say that there aren't, I'm sure there are cases where someone did experience a sexual assault and was denied care. Like, I'm sure there are examples of that.
You were saying, would it be as easy to say that the blue states might take care of their prisoners better? Or it would just,
So here's what I'll say. Typically, kind of, yes.
but again, it
The
comes
more
down
I'm
to
learning,
funding.
the more I'm seeing that New York is really messed up. No offense. There are a lot of problems and New York is a blue state.
Doesn't mean the staff is blue.
Yes,
Yeah.
and yeah, that's certainly a big problem as well.
Yeah.
Yes. But generally, and it's also so dependent on what type of facility it is, because if it's a local jails are funded by the county. And some counties are dirt poor. They're examples of women giving birth in the cell because there's no medical care. Like, they have no money, like, to do anything, offer any programming whatsoever. And at that point, like, what can you do? The people in that county don't wanna pay higher taxes, they don't wanna fund the jail. So the jail only has like X amount of money, you know? So
That
it's
gets
a
into
bit more,
housing, right? Sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand with the thing. But
It's
that,
okay,
so my,
you're-
so thinking about housing these, is that how, like federal inmates end up at like a county jail as well, like housing wise, trying to raise funds and such for these situations?
sometimes, yeah, sometimes the jail, because they'll have beds, they'll take them.
So
Because
okay, that makes sense.
the federal facilities might be so overfull that they
Yeah.
can't. And so the local, because you do have instances of jails and state facilities having federal inmates, and they'll just contract them, the agencies will just contract that amongst themselves.
Here in
Yeah,
our
my brother
county,
was a CEO for years, and that was one that I just had a question on. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
here in our county, there's medical staff that are in the community that have contracts and go in and provide
Mhm.
care. And I remember working at basically the county mental health clinic, which was the Kelly Clinic at the time. If there was an inmate that had mental health needs, they'd give us a call and we'd go down and see them and make recommendations and
yeah.
treat. And it, I think, worked pretty well.
Which goes to show, like, we're not a particularly rich county and we're not a particularly blue county, but
But
nevertheless,
the cost
they
of not
offer
doing it
some,
may
yeah.
be much higher
Yeah.
than not doing it.
So something impels, whether it's
Yeah.
moral goodness or that cost
Yeah.
benefit analysis.
Well,
to have
it's,
certain better
if
services.
you get caught doing something that to the general population looks really bad, that's not gonna go well. So I think they have to say, okay,
Thank goodness for that, I guess.
There's like different models, because yes, in some places they'll contract out. Some facilities have in-house doctors, nurses,
if they're big enough, yeah.
if they're, yeah, or they have enough money.
Yeah.
But some do the contract out model, which again, whatever. makes
Well,
sense.
here, for example, if somebody had an acute need, they might go to the hospital and be handcuffed to their bed.
Mhm, okay.
Or if they had a significant mental health issue, they might be transferred to Rochester Psych or Marcy, which had forensic units. And not to Elmira because they didn't. And, it was always a decision, yeah, this person needs to be in the hospital, so they'd go to an appropriate state facility that was a forensic unit.
Thank you for providing that context. Yeah. All right, existing protections, so I'm trying to keep an eye on the time as
You're good.
well.
Got plenty of time.
I did tease, earlier PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003. So it establishes federal mandates to identify and prevent prison rape in correctional facilities with the jurisdiction of federal, state, local, and native territories across the entire United States. So the Department of Justice adopted the national standards to prevent, detect, and respond to prison rape, which were the PREA standards in 2012. So in addition to establishing mandatory standards for prevention, it requires all correctional facilities to conduct sexual abuse incident reviews and collect uniform data using standardized definitions. And agencies have to ensure data collection includes allegations of sexual abuse and sexual harassment at facilities under its direct control. This incident-based sexual abuse information is aggregated and has to be made available to the public at least once per year. So if you're curious, the information of PREA for New York State, it's there, it's available.
And so since each state does that, it's not like one of those things that Elon Musk can make disappear quite so easily.
As it currently stands, PREA is federal law, and when I talk about the letter that the Bureau of Prisons put out, there's a direct quote there that says, Mr. Trump's executive order does not supersede or change Bureau of Prisons' obligation to comply with federal laws such as the Prison Rape Elimination Act. So as far as it currently stands, the Prison Rape Elimination Act is still the law of the land, and they are still compelled to report or provide data and reporting. So in terms of existing protections, this is where I talk about that lawsuit. There was a transgender woman in Broome County, New York. and there was a lawsuit, that of an event that took place in 2001 when she was incarcerated. And she was denied access to gender affirming care. So, that has been litigated through the courts. She won the lawsuit. As a result of that, Broome County has officially adopted a policy that mandates the housing of inmates is consistent with their gender identity and access to gender affirming care is available. So they have put out that policy. There was a similar settlement in Steuben County, which another transgender woman was denied care. And so Steuben County also changed its policy in its jail. So it has to house people consistent with their gender identity, to respect their name and pronoun changes, and to provide gender affirming care. So those are two things within New York State at the county level. These are jails. They were litigated through the courts, and as a result of that, the counties then published these comprehensive policies. Now, this is like the one win ish. In response to these challenges, we now have a new bill in the New York State Senate. This is Senate Bill S 1049, and it's the Gender Identity, Respect, Dignity, and Safety Act. So it requires that incarcerated individuals in state and local correctional facilities in New York State have access to commissary who have a gender identity different from their assigned sex at birth be addressed, and have access to commissary items, clothing, and other materials that are consistent with the person's gender identity. Establishes that incarcerated individuals shall be presumptively placed in a correctional facility with persons of the gender that most closely aligns with such person's self-attested gender identity, unless the person themselves opts out of such a placement. So this is a bill. It's currently in committee in the Senate. So you as individual people can write or call up your state senator, not the federal government senator, the state senator, and just say, hey, your constituent, care about this bill. You should say yes.
Future action item for our community meals.
It says here, action item.
Nice,
bold.
that's nice.
That wouldn't be in the 5 calls app, because
I
that's
don't
the
think it-
federal.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it would be in the 5 calls app,
Yeah.
but it is a bill that exists that people have signed on to. So that therefore in New York State, state facilities and local facilities then have to adopt policies so that people are placed in facilities that match their gender identity, their self-reported gender identity. Okay, next slide, please. The current state of things. So I mentioned this again, I teased it. Everyone knows about this executive order that came out. The federal government's position is that there are only 2 sexes. Because of that, that impacted what the Bureau of Prisons is doing at the federal level. So last month in February, the Bureau of Prisons announced plans to comply with the current executive order and move all federal inmates to facilities that match their birth sex and not their gender identity. So, again, for years, they would do it on a case-by-case basis in conjunction with PREA, but in light of the executive order, that is no longer the case. They're gonna be automatically transferring inmates. So the Bureau of Prisons 2-page memo details the treatment expected of transgender inmates. The guidelines require prison staff to refer to inmates by their legal name, air quotes, or pronouns corresponding to their biological sex. It said that transgender women would no longer be shielded from pat-down searches by male guards, and they would no longer be permitted to buy bras and other women's clothing items in the commissary, and public funds would no longer be used to purchase items that bind the breasts, remove hair, or allow trans men to use urinals. So in addition to transferring them, a lot of the safeguards that the trans women in male facilities had, where they could only be searched by female guards, they were allowed to wear women's like undergarments. That's being taken away. So a lawsuit filed late February by a dozen transgender women inmates successfully blocked the BOP from moving them. So remember we said the 22, a dozen of them did a class action lawsuit and blocked the Bureau of Prisons from moving them to male facilities. However, this order only applied to the plaintiffs in the case. So only the 12 people that brought the lawsuit, they couldn't be moved, but any other transgender person, the policy still applied to them. Yeah,
They were
so,
doing it for everyone.
yeah. So, again, the Bureau of Prisons official position is that they're complying with the executive order, but that their obligations to comply with federal law and PREA cannot be superseded. And it can't be like, undermined by this executive order. One thing, states can try to individually implement policies to protect the safety and dignity of LGBTQ inmates. So again, like New York is trying to do. Additionally, the executive order cannot supersede existing federal law. So for right now, we are clinging,
Yeah.
we're clinging on. You wanna, all right. Conclusion and questions. So, this is a little bit of the why. So the LGBTQ population generally has, or experiences high rates of poverty, homelessness, and discrimination. The issue of homelessness is a big one because it does put people in more frequent contact with law enforcement, especially if they're underage. So that's how a lot of them come into contact with the criminal justice system. And that's why they're overrepresented. LGBTQ adults are twice as likely as the general population to experience homelessness in their lifetime. We have really high percentages of LGBTQ people living in poverty. And so all of the associated risk factors of being in poverty, obviously it comes with that. They're more likely to have substance use disorders, as a result of discrimination, being rejected by their families, lack of acceptance, things like that. Family rejection, employment discrimination, high cost of gender affirming care, and the absence of safe shelters if they're homeless, and culturally competent some substance use services can lead them to engage in street-based economies. So this is things like selling drugs in order to get by, or being engaged in sex work. And so because of that, they're at an increased risk of involvement with the criminal justice system. So they don't have necessarily, because they're in poverty, they don't have access to jobs or to care. They're more likely to engage in like petty crime, which puts them again at higher risk of contact. One other thing too, LGBTQ people also experience unwarranted pretrial detention due to discriminatory bail practices. So for those of you that don't know, if you're arrested, it takes a long time from your arrest to your sentencing. In between, a lot of court stuff happens. If you're deemed to be safe enough, you can go to your house and just wait, continue your life as you're waiting for all this court stuff to happen. But if not, you're assigned bail, and potentially if you can't pay, then you go to jail. And you, instead of waiting at your house, you wait in jail for all the court stuff to happen. And so LGBTQ people have higher bail amounts than others because they're perceived as flight risks or dangers to the community. Pretrial judges and parole boards fail to recognize chosen families as legitimate support networks for release, and or they fail to acknowledge the responsibility that LGBT people have to non-legally adopted children. And so some of the things that would influence their decision to give someone bail or not, because of LGBTQ people might have unconventional like family structures, they don't perceive that as legitimate and therefore don't weigh that into their decision to grant bail. And again, because they're living in poverty, they're less likely to have the money to pay the bail. So, unfortunately, all of those things, because of lack of acceptance, misunderstanding, not having access to care, all of that compounds and increases the risk factor of, risk factors that LGBTQ people face because of a lot of these executive orders. That is exacerbating those risk factors. If people can't be in homeless shelters, if employment protections are taken away, now you have increased discrimination, the potential for job loss, potential for homelessness as a result of job loss. You're looking at kind of a potential cascade of negative consequences. So,
And eventually, more likely jail then.
Yes.
Because you're trying to
Yeah.
make some money
mhm,
then.
exactly. Yeah,
It's a
or
vicious
worse,
cycle.
or worse, the mental health will decline. You're looking at potentially suicide.
Mhm.
High rate, oh, and LGBTQ people already have higher rates of suicide than the general population. So you're looking potentially at a worse kind of increase in that. So that's really depressing.
It is.
Do you have questions? Are there any things you want to explore in a little bit more detail?
This thing about like the lack of recognition of, you know, traditionally LGBTQ, oh God, I'm being one of the people who can't say the letters, LGBTQ people, finding ways to, you know, get around all of these barriers with the found families and the non-traditional sort of, you know, ways we make lives. That's both a safety net that we've created ourselves, but it's also like a potential danger pitfall when you get involved in the criminal system and judges are like, no, you have no family, so how can I possibly trust it? But so I wonder if there's a possibility there for like, and maybe this has happened somewhere, like educational campaigns for judges and like as a small community here in Yates County where it's not so hard for us to like access our local judges and our family judges, like would embarking on a campaign of like, hey, sit down with us and let's talk about like the reality of found family structures so that like you can sentence people appropriately, understanding what they've got and what they don't got.
Can I, is it all right with everyone if I just go on a tiny mini rant? So, the thing that you're describing, a lot of the people in academia are doing work to help, inform like risk assessment modeling. And so if you have people who come in and say, we're looking at this all wrong, we need to include these other factors. A lot of the obstacles in higher ed that we have is getting people who are practitioners to adopt the research that we're putting out because they say, no, you're not doing the work, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm like on the street doing the work, and so they delegitimize like the research that we put forth. I'm sure there are many risk assessment instruments that judges can use that are more holistic and take into account all of these things, the unique risk factors of intersectionality, things that like people of color are experiencing that are unique and different. But it's a matter of getting judges to take that on. And that we have found in academia, that's the obstacle. It's not that the research isn't there. It's not like we haven't created the tools. They just don't want to take them.
So is the missing piece like, so the tools are created and they're there, but then like if the judge is like, well, I don't care, they're not even gonna look at it, like are there steps to take like outreach, you know, if a judge is willing to take a meeting with a community group focused on LGBTQ issues. I'm not thinking like broadly here, but I'm thinking like, you know, I have a meeting once a year with Judge Cook. Like I can be like, hey, Judge Cook, this is something we should really talk about. And I feel like he would, and it's not Judge Cook anymore, it's Judge Stutzman, it changes. Anyway, I feel like they would be, you know, open to a discussion with people they've already got a little bit of a relationship with. That's not the answer for like people in San Francisco, California, and in New York City, but like, is there anything that you would say that you think would be effective about that on a small scale, community to community?
This also like I don't want, I want to make sure I'm being extremely balanced and not like too biased. In some cases, judges are elected, so I will just leave it at that. In some jurisdiction, judges are elected officials, just like any other elected official, privy to the whims of the constituents.
Right,
And so in that case, there's plenty of room there.
yeah.
In a lot of places, it's at the very local level, that judges are often elected. And it's also at the very local levels that they run uncontested for decades.
Yeah.
So there's definitely opportunity there.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's tough. I mean, these are the things that like frustrate me as well, because it's not like we don't have solutions. Our risk assessments problematic. Certainly there's flaws with all of them, but we don't know what the flaws are until we put them into practice and then we can test it.
Mhm.
But if you don't let us,
Yeah,
then
Mhm.
yeah, then there's nothing we can do.
indeed.
So that's a good question. But yeah, some people in academia are looking at things more holistically and looking at making data-driven like decisions,
Mhm.
not in like a creepy AI
No, yeah,
way.
yeah.
If any of you are interested, I have a couple monographs that are designed for professional continuing medical education, and one of them is called Promotion of the Health of Gender, Promoting the Health of Gender and Sexual Minorities.
Mhm.
And the other is Clinical Care of the Transgender Patient. So if any of you are interested, I can get you the links and email them out, because they're pretty well-written monographs.
Yeah, that's handy.
And I think trying to get the medical community educated where many might not have paid any attention in medical school is important. And I was gonna mention that I'm on the community services board,
Mhm.
and so I interact with all of the community agencies in addition to the community service office. And I'm thinking, we hear about agencies that address substance use and developmental disabilities and mental health issues and all that kind of stuff. And I'm wondering whether or not that would be a forum where having some input or doing a presentation for them at some time, more than just me there, might be worthwhile to educate the community more. It's another opportunity.
Is that the same as the Human Services Committee, or is that a different thing at the like county level?
It's the Community Service Board has oversight of the mental health services, the developmental disability services, and the substance use services. So there's a number of agencies that come and report. And there's a community services director. He has authority to sign paperwork to commit somebody to the hospital. Many of the doctors at the hospital also have a different kind of authority and can commit someone under a different section of the law. And two physicians, actually, if you have two that aren't, one is a psychiatrist, that's a third avenue to get somebody in the hospital. But I'm just, as we were talking, I was thinking, that's a group that, could probably always use education. The other is Cupid College. I know we've talked about that more, but this last week we had a really nice interchange with a number of students who attended our grief support group. And that's a new connection that I have now, I think, in their occupational therapy section. But they also have a social work program, and, those are folks who really need to know. So I can do some talking with the people that I'm connected with out there and see what interest they might have.
Yeah, I asked about the human service thing because I delivered a
I
little.
think that's a little different. I think
I think what
that's
you're
probably
saying
under
is,
public health.
right. I think it's a collection of things that includes public health, because I delivered a little comment to the legislature yesterday at their
Yeah.
meeting, and one of the legislators recommended that I take those comments to the Human Services Committee.
I think that's
which I think
different
is
from
like,
community services.
yes, and they kind of missed the point of me delivering it to the legislature itself, but that's a story for another day.
Oh, did you exit the PowerPoint?
I did, but I
Can you pull it back up
up?
just so you could see the references? So a lot of the reports and stuff and the Senate bill, I put the link there, so if you click it, it will show you like where it's at
Oh,
in its
fantastic.
process. And then on the sidebar, it says, tell us how you feel about this bill. You might be able to just like send a message and say, hey,
Okay.
this looks great. I support this bill.
Yeah, more of us should do that.
And Nate, I stopped sharing the screen, so we'll try and send the PowerPoint out. So if you want to click on things.
The other thing that I'd heard the other day on the radio that was interesting, that sort of hits this, has to do with a bill that was passed that allows long-term inmates to be considered for early release. And what they're saying is the recidivism rate in this particular population is pretty low.
Yeah.
And many of these people have been in jail for years and years and years. There are probably some who shouldn't be, but it does reduce the cost of jail, and there's some other benefits of it. That is a law that applies only to federal prisons.
Mhm.
And so state prisons don't have to do it, or don't have to consider.
Typically states have their own individual
Yes.
policies as to how
Yeah.
they do that.
Yeah,
Um,
but it was a very interesting talk, and I don't remember the name of the bill, but.
I will just say, early release or medical release for like people who are terminally ill, that is very unpopular.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Like with the people.
with the people of the nation.
Well, and I think probably that may have to do with the people not really understanding that, here you've had somebody in jail for 40 years, and they've been doing fine and have support to be back out in the community. And some people would say, no, they were put in for 50 years, they gotta serve the 50 years.
We're a very vengeful population.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that.
it was a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because this is again, slightly outside the scope of this conversation, but one of the things that we're experiencing in the incarcerated population is because of how. So in the 80s, things just skyrocketed in the United States in terms of incarceration rates. The population ballooned. And those people that were incarcerated during that time have really, really long sentences. They're getting super old now and they're still in prison. So the cost of incarceration is so astronomically high because they have to care for them because they're elderly.
Yep.
And there's no infrastructure because that population that we ballooned in the 80s is now at the age where they need all of this care.
Hospice.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And so that is kind of presenting the criminal justice system with a new challenge right now, was how to deal with. And again, we have medical release where people who are terminally ill or can be released early and just go die with their families instead of taking up like taxpayer money being in prison. And that's not popular. And yeah.
Change the style. Okay, thanks, Nate.
Hi, Nate.
Yeah, thank you guys. Have a great night.
Thanks for coming.
Good night.
Good night.
Like who'd have thunk there'd be like consequences to vastly increasing the number of people we have.
America has the highest incarceration
Yeah.
rate of any like country
Yeah, it's
in the world.
it's madness.
And we're trying to like engage with that. But again, the population, the nation is so resistant to changes, philosophical changes in how we engage with people who commit crime.
Like execution is very costly. We can
Yes.
save a bunch of money by doing away with that.
So no, you know what people would say is, don't give them a trial, just go out in the back and shoot them.
And
I'm like-
that's probably true.
And can we
And
talk about how many people are falsely convicted
Yeah.
for capital
Yes.
crimes?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. And it's like, well, you're saying that, but you're taking away the safeguard because what if we make a mistake? Like, are you okay with just killing an innocent person?
And people don't think that
They
through.
don't think that way.
Yes. And there are instances, and we're seeing so many, like with the advent of forensic technology, we have seen people who have been executed
Yeah.
posthumously being exonerated, and it's devastating to think that they were executed, and now after the fact, we did testing, and now we know that they are in fact innocent.
It's horrible.
And there's people when I talk about the Innocence Project, there's people who are incarcerated for decades, and then they're finally able to be exonerated. And it's just like, what do you do? And then some people are like, oh, they're fine. I'm like, do we give services? Do we help them? Like in some states, they're not even required to get compensated if they're wrongfully. In Pennsylvania, there's no law. Remember that guy?
I don't remember.
When I was in grad school, there was a guy, Jim Foley. He was incarcerated for like 47 years. And there's no law in Pennsylvania that says they have to get any compensation for being wrongfully incarcerated. Like his wife left him, and it's like now he's released.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Whoop-de-doo, yeah,
You don't have any
Enter.
compensation money.
Really
And try
sad.
another prison.
Yeah,
Rob a
maybe.
bank.
yeah. It's devastating.
Yeah.
I'm getting off
It's-
topic.
No, it's,
All right, this concludes this ABC session.
thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.
Very informative. As always. Yeah.
So I'm gonna stop the recording.
If you want to talk